Hi guys, so I'm back with the solution of the second puzzle. I recall that the puzzle was this one. Can white steal castle in this position? Okay, if you miss the previous video, you can pause the video and actually try to solve this problem. Now let's go for the solution. Okay, so can white steal castle? The first thing we can see is that the black king is double checked by a bishop and a rook. And we're gonna start our analysis from this. Let's pick the analyzer and we're gonna try to understand this position. If you saw my previous videos, it should recall you something. We already saw this. It was not exactly the same thing, but we saw something which was close. And we know that to obtain this position, it's not possible for the bishop to go, let's say, from a6 to c6 double check, and the same, it's not possible for the rook to come from b5 to a8 double check. So there is only one possibility to do this. It means that this was the position a few moves ago. The bishop moved there, check, and black played b5 and white took en passant double check. So if we go in the past from two moves, we arrive to this position. And this gives us what we need to start our analysis. It means that the point b7 was there just one move ago. And so it means that the bishop, which is actually in g6, is a promoted bishop. Because this bishop couldn't start from c8. Because it couldn't leave c8 actually. So it means that the bishop in c8 was taken by white on c8. Okay, so we know that this bishop is a promoted bishop. Which pawn was promoted? Well, it's not g7 because g7 is actually in f6. So it's probably something like c7 or a7. And we'll see this. We need to see how it's possible to be promoted and how many captures a pawn could do to be promoted. First, we see that we have 12 pieces for white. So white lost 4 pieces, and one of these pieces was taken in f6 by the pawn g7. Okay? So it leaves us with 2 white pawns are missing, 1 bishop and 1 knight, and something was taken in f6. So a pawn which started, for instance, in c7 or a7 could make 3 captures to be promoted. And it needs to be promoted on b1, d1, f1, because the bishop is a bishop of light squares. And we know it's not b1, because if the pawn was promoted in b1, the bishop couldn't leave b1. Okay, so it means that we have a promoted pawn. It will be c7 because to reach d1 or f1, it will be complicated for a7, so it's easier to consider that it's the one in c7. And we'll see that it's even not possible for a7. We'll see this just later. Okay, so let's imagine that we have a pawn in c7 and we want to be promoted in d1 or in f1. How many captures we can do? Recall that we have at most 3 captures, because 4 white pieces are missing and 1 was taken on f6. Let's try to do it with 1 one capture or maybe two captures, we'll see. Okay, the pawn could go from c7 to c3, take something in g2, and be promoted in g1. So it's possible to do it with only one capture. But then it means that the pawn was at the moment in g2. And if the pawn was in g2 and then in g1, it means that when the pawn was in g2, the white king was in check by the pawn. And so the white king had to move. Then the promoted pawn was promoted in g1 in bishop. And then the white king was back in e1. And so it means that it's not possible anymore for white to castle. So if white won a castle, it means that it's not like this. It's not from g2 that the black pawn was actually promoted. So it reveals that we can absolutely forget a7, because if the pawn started in a7, it's 1, 2, 3 captures to arrive in d1, and we know that if we go in d1 like this, it means that the problem is solved, and the answer is white cannot castle. But now let's consider c7. You could take one time, a second time, and maybe after arriving in e2, take something in f1 or in d1 and promote in bishop. And then you made 3 captures. And 3 captures are actually available for black. So it seems possible. Let's see if this is possible. Okay, so now we need to check this precisely. Okay, so something was taken there, and then we made 3 captures. What is missing? The h pawn, a knight, a bishop, and one of the pawn in e2 or g2, because the point f3 could come from g2 or e2. Okay. So, is it possible or not? Could this pawn c7 made 3 captures and be promoted in d1 or f1? We need to check this. So, we can imagine that, let's say that the bishop, which started in c1, was taken in f6. So we have to take the pawn in h, one of the pawn there, and a knight. Okay, so to take, for instance, the pawn which started in e2, it would be easy. Could be taken in e4. The knight could be taken in, let's say, g5. So it could be c5, take. And now we need to take the point which starting in h. So this is the problem. Of course, to take the point which started in h2, it means that h2 also need to be promoted. Is it possible? To be promoted, the point which started in h just needs one capture, and it could be promoted in g8. So, is this capture available? For black, we have 4, 4, 4, a rook, so 3. Wait, 3 pieces are missing? Yes, we have 2 rooks, so 1 knight is missing and 2 pawns. Okay, so 1 knight is missing and 2 pawns. But we have a problem, because the pawn actually in a5 took 1 time. Then we know that he will take another time in b6, because remember that the position is this one. So it means that the pawn in b6 made actually 2 captures. Well, so in this position he made 1. So let's say he took the pawn which started in a7, and then it took b7. Okay. The pawn in c7 cannot be taken because this is the one which is actually promoted. So it leaves us with a bishop, which was actually taken on c8. So we have only a knight. But the problem is that the knight was taken in f3. So there is no capture available for the pawn h2. And so h2 couldn't be promoted in this position. So this is not possible. And the pawn, which started in c7, couldn't make 3 captures in this configuration. Now we need also to consider that maybe this pawn didn't came from g, but maybe came from e, but it won't change anything, because if it came from e, it means that the pawn in g could be promoted without any captures. So it's the same. Finally, this pawn can be taken like the pawn by the pawn c7, but again, for the same reason, the pawn h2 had to be promoted, and to be promoted, he needs 1 capture, but this capture is not available. So in this position, we know, since this bishop is promoted, we know that it was with the pawn which started in c7, and it was promoted in d1 after a capture in d2, and so the white king had to move to let the pawn d2 being promoted in bishop in d1. And so this white king in this position already moved. So this solved the problem. White cannot castle in this position. Remember that I have another problem, which is actually just a variation of this one, but it's harder to solve it. So in this position, which is almost the same, the principal difference is that 1 pawn of black is also missing on the right side. So we're gonna arrive to the same problem. One black pawn will need to be promoted, but we don't know if it's c7 or maybe g7. Okay, so let's take the analyzer. We want to know if white can castle or not in this position. So for the same reason, we know that the previous position was this one. So it means that this bishop is a promoted bishop. And for the same reason, it means that something needs to be promoted on d1, f1, or maybe h1. Well, h1, it won't be possible, because if it's promoted in h1, it means that the rook moved, and so white cannot castle. So we arrive to the same position, and we know that c7 or g7, because of course e6 came from f7, need a promotion. Okay. We can start with c7, because it's easy to see that it's almost the same problem. Actually, the problem is if it's promoted in d1, it needs to be with 3 captures, because if it's only with 1 capture, it means that it came from d2, and so the white king had to move, and so white cannot castle. So we need 3 captures. Actually, 3 white pieces are missing, so it's already dead. Okay, 4, 4, 4, 1. So 3 white pieces are missing. So for c7, it's directly not possible to make 3 captures, because remember that 1 capture was made on e6. So only 2 captures are possible for the pawn in c7 to be promoted. And so it's not possible to reach like e2 and then make another capture in f1 or in d1, because it needs 3 captures. So in this position, if the pawn c7 is promoted in a bishop, it's in d1, and for the exact same reason, it means that it came from d2, and so the white king had to move previously in the game, and so white cannot castle. What about the pawn g7? This is the harder part of the problem. Well, we're gonna start the analysis of the possible promotion of g7 with the easiest possibilities. First, the pawn came in g4, took something in h3, and was promoted in h1. In this case, the rook had to move, and so it's not possible for white to castle. Another option is to make 3 captures, exactly like for c7. It won't be possible because in this position, remember that 1 capture was made in e6, and so only 2 captures are possible for the pawn which started in g7. So only 2 captures. So in 2 captures, you cannot reach f1. You cannot reach something like this, except, and this will be the hard part actually, except if these 2 white pawns crossed. I mean, if the pawn which is in g3 came from h2, and if the pawn in h4 came from g2, then maybe the pawn in g7 could just go straight to g2, make a capture in f1, being promoted in bishop, and then the bishop return in g6. For this, it's easy. For instance, the pawn in g2 captured something in h3 and goes in h4. The other pawn is still in h2. The pawn g7 goes in g2, and then the pawn in h2 captured something in g3. And this is not easy to see why this is not possible. Well, of course, the key is to see what are the captures there. Because if this happened, it means that these 2 pawns made 2 captures, one from g2 to g3 or g3 to g4, and one from h2 to g3. Okay, so it's 2 captures. We're gonna count the black pieces that are actually missing. So we have 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. So actually 5 black pieces are missing. But we know that the pawn b6, made 2 captures. Remember that this was the position, so the pawn in a5 had to make 1 capture, like from b2 to b3, then another capture in b6. Okay, so this pawn, let's say, made 2 captures, for instance, the pawn in a7 and the pawn in b7. Okay, so this 2 pawn was taken by this one. The pawn g7 was never captured because it was promoted in g6. The bishop in c8 was captured on c8 because we had a pawn in b7 just previously. So it leaves us with how many possible captures? Actually, only 2 captures, because this pawn made 2 captures. 1 capture was made on c8, so we have only the c7 pawn and 1 knight. So it means that these 2 pawns, if they crossed, it means that they captured 1 knight and the pawn c7. Wait. Okay, 1 knight it's possible, but the pawn c7. Okay, so it means that the pawn c7 was also promoted. Is it possible? Is it possible to be promoted? It means that it made at least 1 capture in b2 to be promoted in b1. Okay, so now, again, we need to count. It means that we have one capture in F1 by the pawn which started in G7 to be promoted. We need one capture from the pawn in C7, like for instance in B2 to be promoted in B1, to be taken in column G or H, so that these two pawns could cross. And another piece was taken in E6. So is it possible? What are the three white pieces that are missing? One bishop, one knight, and the D pawn. Okay, so since in this variation the pawn C7 cannot be promoted, of course, in D1 for the same reason, because it would mean that actually white cannot castle. It should take something like in B2. Okay, it could be the bishop which started in C1, for instance. It could take this bishop in B2 and being promoted in B1. Okay, so this is possible. Then you need to take something in F1. Okay, it could be a knight, like the pawn G7, arrive in G2, capture the knight in F1, be promoted in bishop of light squares, and return in G6. And we know that in E6, the pawn D need to be taken. And now we have a problem, because to be taken in D, it means that the pawn D needs at least one capture. But remember that no captures are available in this variation for white, because two captures was made there, two capture was made by the pawn B6, and one capture was made in C8, actually the bishop, which was taken in C8, because like I said just previously, one pawn was in B7. So it means that the 5 possible captures are already made in this variation, and so there is no available capture for the pawn D to be captured in E6. And so this is not possible, and white cannot castle. Well, was not easy, I guess, no? Tell me in the comment if you had it, if you had the solution. If you had it now, I guess you're an expert in retrograde analysis. And, well, I will leave you with another problem. Let's see my next problem. Again, it's how many moves to checkmate, and it's white to play. So white need to checkmate the black king. How many moves you need? How many moves are required? Tell me also in the comment if you have the solution of this one, and see you next time for a new problem and the solution of this one. Bye bye!